to memorize this URL right now. And I have my email up there. I also have it on the wall here. I have a full presentation today. This is a big book. So I'm afraid we're not going to have time for the usual discussion. So in lieu of that, please feel free to use my email. Send me today, tomorrow, later in the week, send me your questions, your insights, your complaints, and I'll work them into the presentation next Sunday. Thomas Jefferson dismissed our book as the ravings of a maniac. My Boston friend Linda, whom I have known since 6th grade, emailed me this. I always thought someone got stoned and pinned up a bunch of hallucinations. Well, I wouldn't go as far as Tom or Linda, but I do sometimes suspect the book has caused more trouble than it's worth. Yeah. And I'm not alone. Luke Timothy Johnson, the Roman Catholic curmudgeon over at Emery's Candler, has written this. Few writings in all of literature have been so obsessively read with such generally disastrous results. It's a story of tragic misinterpretation resulting from a fundamental misapprehension. Its arcane symbols have nurtured illusionary systems to the destruction of their fashioners and to the discredit of the writing. Well, just think about the overheated prophecies from people like Jerry Falwell, John Hadji, Jim Baker, or Pat Robertson. Or think about how Lindsay's The Late Great Planet Earth, which was the best-selling nonfiction, speaking loosely, nonfiction book of the entire 1970s. Oh, by the way, Hal Lindsay finally died November 25th at age 95. Yeah. I was starting to think he was going to stick around for the second coming. The world would be a healthier place if some of these guys had taken up the study of chess. Question, how many of you know the term dispensationalism? Only a couple. Good, I finally get to teach something. Here we go. Now, if you can't read all of these small fonts, remember, you can access the slides at home on your computer. Probably, I'm guessing, what, Tuesday? Sure. Virginia does her magic for us on this. Okay, a quick 5-minute digression about dispensationalism. Most mainstream futuristic or prophetic Christianity today falls under that rubric. For 2,000 years, Christians have talked about the second coming, the return of Christ, but the particular contours of our end times fixation are surprisingly recent. Since it's popular with literalists, dispensationalism is commonly found today in non-denominational Bible churches, among some Baptists, Pentecostals, Charismatics. The name itself, dispensationalism, comes from a book in 1928 by Philip Morrow, who was not sympathetic. I said it's recent, that's less than a century ago. Dispensationalism begins with the notion that God has ordained different ages or eras or dispensations, beginning with the age of innocence in Eden, which they take literally. Dispensationalist theology preaches the rapture, the tribulation, the millennialist kingdom. Devotees argue over just how many dispensations there are. Some say 3, some say 8. And what the sequence is. Some call themselves premillennialist, others postmillennialist. What we now call dispensationalism was systematized by an Anglo-Irish priest named John Nelson Darby from about 1832 on. That's less than 2 centuries ago. Again, this is recent stuff. Dispensationalism began to spread in the United States thanks to people like the famous evangelist Dwight L. Moody. And schools sprang up to teach this stuff. Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, Biola, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, the Niagara Bible Conference. A big boost came in 1909 when Cyrus Schofield, who attended the Niagara meetings and was shaped by Darby, published the Schofield Reference Bible. How many of you have heard of that? The Schofield, oh God, several of you, good, good. What it does is to chain thousands of scripture verses together into alleged prophecies and fulfillments. And by the way, some of his disciples, Schofield disciples, founded Dallas Theological Seminary. Hal Lindsey was one of the graduates. DTS is the best-known training center in the United States for dispensationalism. Other DTS grads you may know include Chuck Swindoll, Atlanta's Andy Stanley. It begins to sound like an interlocking directorate. So many of these people knew each other or influenced each other. And another graduate of DTS was Tim LaHaye, a Baptist minister who, with Jerry Jenkins, foisted upon the world the phenomenally popular Left Behind franchise. 16 novels between 1995 and 2007, plus a plethora of films, music productions, even video games. In the fundamentalist churches I grew up in, we used to sing a hymn that included these lines: two will be together grinding at the mill, one will be taken, the other left behind. That hymn was based on Jesus' sayings in what we call the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talks to his disciples about the end of the world. It was Darby, back around 1830, who invented the name for what Jesus was describing, the rapture. At a certain moment in the future, all the good people will be whooshed up to heaven, and only the bad guys will be left down here, your neighbors that you don't like. In 2004, Newsweek ran a report, a poll. They found that 55% of Americans thought that Christians would be taken up in the rapture. That was in 2004. Much more recently, Pew Research Center reported in 2022 that 14% of American Christians think Jesus is going to come back in their lifetime. That's about 30%. That's about 30 million of your neighbors. This is popular stuff. Now, according to dispensationalism, the Jesus sayings in Matthew 24 link up to what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4:17. Paul resorts to the Greek word, Sandy, harpazo, seize. He says that all the Jesus people, living and dead, will be seized away in the clouds to meet the returning Lord in the air. And if you find a Schofield Reference Bible and you look up the rapture in Matthew 24, the marginal note, the chain, will send you to 1 Thessalonians, along with later references in 3 different chapters of Revelation. I probably should remind you that our familiar chapter and verse divisions are recent, like dispensationalism itself. The chapter divisions were not made until the Middle Ages, and verse divisions first appeared in English language Bibles around 1560, the famous Geneva Bible. Okay, end of the 5-minute digression. I promise I will not mention dispensationalism again. But a moment ago, John, the former English teacher, pointed out a key thing about the book of Revelation. It is jam-packed with allusions to other Bible books, mainly the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament. At the time our book was being written, the rabbis were finalizing the canon of the Hebrew Bible, which we then adopted. There aren't too many references to the New Testament. The canon of the New Testament was not settled until after 370, believe it or not. So, Revelation is packed with echoes from Old Testament books, Genesis, Psalms, Proverbs, Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Lamentations, Isaiah, Amos, Joel, Haggai, on and on. British scholar Steve Moyes has an entire book tracing all of this. Bottom line, he finds that 70% of the verses in Revelation contain Old Testament echoes. Now, to illustrate the elusive hyperlinks in this dream fantasy we call Revelation, I have two passages for us to consider. First, in the first chapter, our narrator describes his vision of Jesus. And to give you a break from my voice all the time, Nedra used to be a lectionary reader, so I've twisted her arm and offered to bring her coffee in bed for the next week, and she's going to...
Okay. I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters.
Thank you. Still got it, lady. The description of Jesus here, as you see from the bottom, is pretty much a pastiche of allusions to the book of Daniel. And you notice where Jesus got his favorite self-definition out of that chapter in Daniel, which is echoed in the last book of the Bible. The Son of Man, I don't think, is found anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. Send me an email if I'm wrong. This is also the first time that Revelation uses the number 7. 7 lampstands. Yeah. Which is all over the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Over 700 times, in fact. Now, we're going to come back to the numbers in a minute, but let's look at a second illustration of the elusive hyperlinks in this dream fantasy. This is one of the wildest passages in a wild book. Nedra, do you mind again? There we go.
A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days.
Maybe my friend Linda was right. He got stoned. In the Genesis story itself, the snake is just a snake. But before long, interpreters turned it into a dragon and then into Satan. Our red dragon is Satan, the supreme fallen angel. For instance, the next 3 verses tell us about the war in heaven. It's short, so I'll give Nedra a break. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. The most famous depiction of this war in heaven is, of course, Milton's Paradise Lost. But I won't read that to you. The next screen explains some of the details in this wild passage. And I'm sorry that I had to go to a small font to get them all on one screen. Again, when you access this at home this coming week, you won't have any trouble with that. So you can come back to that, but look at towards the end of it. The woman goes into exile in the wilderness. That might remind you as an allusion to Hagar and Ishmael, right? But there's something else that the writer has in mind. In the book of Lamentations, which we don't pay enough attention to, we have Lady Zion, who goes into exile in the wilderness for half of a Sabbath cycle. And Sabbath, of course, reminds us of that number 7 again. But you wonder why 1,260 days? Well, if you do half of 7, you get 3 1/2, and 3 1/2 years is about that number. Crazy, huh?
Yeah.
Why do we have so many echoes of the Hebrew Bible? Why this epidemic of allusions? The answer is literary genre. And you knew that John, the former English teacher, would work that in somewhere. This is a type of literature we call apocalypse. An apocalypse predicts the future, but it's not a weather report. It's all about suffering, and it has 4 purposes. It urges fidelity on the faithful, it urges endurance on their part, it promises reward to them if they hang in there, and it promises that the bad guys are going to get punished. Like any literary genre, apocalypse has its conventions, fabulous beasts and so forth. Above all, literature that is apocalyptic is dualistic. It's black versus white, dark versus light, God versus Satan. And it says that things are going to get so bad that even God must personally intervene to restore justice and order. Apocalypse is awfully important in the Jewish tradition, especially after the Babylonian exile, which, as you all know, started in 597 BCE. From about 600 BCE to about 1400, Jewish literature produced an awful lot of apocalypses. That's a period of 2,000 years, so this is just a partial listing for you. You may have heard of some of these, like Enoch, but I doubt that you have all of them memorized. And, of course, early Christians produced a lot of apocalypses. Well, of course, because all early Christians were Jews.
Yeah.
Here's a partial list at the top. I confess I've only looked a few of these up. If you Google them, you can find full text for many of these, if there's nothing good on TV. And Gnostic Christians, of course, also produced apocalypses. Here are a couple to get you started. Apocalypse, then, is a type of prophecy. Jewish culture was keen on prophecy in both senses of the word, telling forth the word of God for today, and foretelling or predicting tomorrow. If you're an English teacher, of course etymology is one of your favorite bigology words. Where do words come from? And in the Greek, to uncover gives us the noun apocalypse. Sandy, apocalypsis, right? Is that right?
Well,
Oh.
yes.
In particular, it means uncovering or revealing things about the eschaton, the last things. What's going to happen at the end of the world as we know it. So, another ology word, what we call eschatology, is the study of last things. The word apocalypse, apocalypsis, is actually the first word in Greek at the very beginning of the book of Revelation. Now, apocalypse, of course, can also be a secular concept. Some of us are old enough that we grew up with 1964's Dr. Strangelove or 1979's Apocalypse Now. You can waste a lot of time when you get home today by Googling recent apocalyptic movies or novels. I tried that, and there went the day. I have on screen for you some recommended reading. Next week, when you access this at home, you can follow up on these. And I would like to thank Sandy and Neva, here you are, and Neva for putting me onto this one. The Arthur Crystal essay is just wonderful. Another example of secular apocalypse, you may have it memorized, is Robert Frost's poem, Fire and Ice. Frost was not religious, certainly not Christian, but his poem does uncover details about the end of the world, what the two big scientific theories were in 1923, that we would get too close to the sun or too far away from the sun. And Frost, with his cynical bent, says, don't worry about the scientific theories. Human nature will take care of things.
So true.
Some will say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Smart alecky. In one way, Revelation parts with the conventions of the genre. Apocalyptic literature always has narrators who are from the ancient world, people like Moses or Ezra. Pseudonymity, in other words, is a big characteristic. But our writer uses his own name. 4 times he says, I, John. So who was this John? Well, early Christians debated whether he should be identified as John, son of Zebedee, brother of James, a member of the original 12 disciples. And there are a few similarities between the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation, which suggests maybe whoever wrote the Gospel was involved with this book. Jesus is the Lamb. He's the Good Shepherd. He's the living water. It seems our author probably was a Jew because the book's Greek is famously atrocious. And it's also adulterated with a lot of what we call Aramaicisms. As you know, the first language for most Jews was Aramaic. And same thing for our author. And so he was turning some of the Aramaic words he knew into what he assumed must be Greek. Most Jews used Aramaic as their first language, and they knew some Greek, surprisingly not that much of their own Hebrew. Polycrates, name your next puppy dog that. Polycrates was bishop of Ephesus in the late 2nd century, and he argued for authorship by John the disciple. Late 2nd century. If you back up for 100 years, Papias thought our writer was not John, son of Zebedee, but the elder. Remember 2nd John and 3rd John? He said, no, the elder is the author. Now, we don't have Papias' own endorsement. We get it at second hand from a guy with another wonderful name, Eusebius. But Eusebius was 4th century. 1st century, 2nd and 4th. So we might want to be a bit skeptical about all these attributions. Scholars generally go with a third possibility. They say the book is something that emerged from the Johannine school. Now, early Christians were just like us. They had their denominations. Methodists, Presbyterians. In 1 Corinthians 1:12, I think, Paul says, one man says, I belong to Paul. Another says, I belong to Apollos. Another says, I belong to Peter. And many of them said, I belong to John. So the Johannine school seems to have given us a total of 5 books in our New Testament. The Gospel, 1st John, 2nd John, 3rd John, and Revelation. And our author doesn't give us any information that would help to settle the question. He just tells us his name repeatedly. Oh, he says twice. He says twice that he was a victim of Rome who was exiled to Patmos, a rocky island in the Aegean about 5 miles by 10 miles. Think of Napoleon on Elba, or later St. Helena. So we just don't know who the author was. Scholars usually call him John the Seer or John of Patmos. Well, but there is a consensus on the dating of the book, towards the end of the first century, which means that if our John was the disciple, the fisherman from Galilee, in that world he would have been a very old man indeed. You notice that I have transitioned from talking about the end of the world to talking about the historical context of the writer of the book. And this is a cool irony. Apocalyptic literature is about the future, but it would bring a lot more clarity to it if we know something about the past, namely the century that produced it. For example, the very first chapter of Revelation reports that Jews in Asia were undergoing persecution. Recall that the great fire in Rome in 64, Nero blamed on the Christians. And so for the next 3.5 years, Nero persecuted Christians in and around Rome. When Revelation was being written, we think that the later so-called Great Persecution under Domitian was in full swing. Domitian wanted everybody to call him Dominus et Deus Noster, our Lord and God. And of course, the earliest, most basic Christian confession is Jesus is Lord. Two lords? Well, yeah. Remember that the titulus, the placard presumably on the cross, where they gave the reason for execution, had what Pilate said Jesus had claimed King of the Jews. So from the very beginning, there was bound to be tension between Christians and Jews. I'm going to give you two examples of how knowing about the first century can help to bring clarity to this book about the final century. First, Armageddon. Say that 10 times. Yeah. Here's a nice map for you. And you notice that Armageddon is that dot in North Israel, south of the Golan Heights, south of the Sea of Galilee, south of Nazareth. It's in the middle of what is called the plain of Megiddo. Armageddon is wrong. It's really Har Megiddo. Har means hill. So the hill of Megiddo. And the plain of Megiddo was an interstate highway in the ancient world. That was the route that tradesmen and armies used to get from up north, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, down south, Egypt, to go back and forth. That was the land bridge. And so Har Megiddo, the hill of Megiddo, became a very important military post to protect and fight over the plain of Megiddo. Actually, that's a bad translation. Tel, T-E-L, is what we should really call it. A tel is a man-made hill. It's a mound that is built up over centuries as generations of people build and rebuild on the ruins of preceding towns or forts. And eventually, you get a man-made mountain. Well, not really a mountain, but as you can see, it's considerably higher than the flat plain of Megiddo around it, right? Military people love the high ground, of course. They teach the cliche at places like West Point, don't fight uphill. If you have the high ground, you can see your enemy much farther away, and your projectiles like stones or cannonballs have a lot more potency because gravity is working for them instead of against them, right? In the Six-Day War, 1967, some of us are actually old enough to remember that vividly. Syria and Israel fought over possession of the Golan Heights, of course. Now, Armageddon is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. It's mentioned 12 times. It's a big deal in the ancient world. It doesn't mean anything to us unless you travel to Israel. But John's audience would have recognized it as the perfect setting for the showdown. Gunfight at the OK Corral. High noon on Main Street. I said we'd come back to numbers. Let's look at numerology for our second example of how knowing something about the ancient world can bring clarity to this book about the future. 7, for example, we've already seen 7. The dragon with 7 heads and 7 crowns. But 7, it's everywhere, not just in the Old Testament, 700 times. It's also everywhere in Revelation. We have 7 churches, 7 lampstands, 7 angels. It goes on and on. Sometimes the Bible plays with 7 times the base 10, 70. For example, the Great Tribulation that I mentioned earlier is taken from Daniel chapter 9, which gives us the prophecy of 70 weeks. And Luke chapter 10 tells us that Jesus had not 12 disciples, but 70. Well, some manuscripts say 72. What? You can think of other examples where 7 appears. Deuteronomy 15 says on every 7th year, Jews were to cancel all debts and free all their slaves.
Oh, wow.
Well, there's some dispute about whether that was ever actually honored. Leviticus 25 orders a jubilee year every 50th, right? That is, after each cycle of 7 times 7 years, or 49. And of course, as you know, in Matthew, Peter says to Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive Nedra? And Jesus says 70 times 7. 12 is another important number in the Bible. It pops up 22 times in Revelation alone. I won't tell you how long it took me to count that. Revelation 21, at the end of the book, says John saw the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven onto the Temple Mount. And he describes it this way. It has a great high wall with 12 gates. And at the gates 12 angels. And on the gates are inscribed the names of the 12 tribes. On these 3 gates, on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city has 12 foundations. And on them are the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lord. A lot of graffiti artists around. The number even gets doubled. From chapter 4 on, Revelation tells us 6 different times that there were 24 elders around the throne of God. It seems to be a combination of the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles. The craziest variation on 12 is 144,000. The number of the elect. That's used twice in the book. 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. So, what about the most famous or infamous number? 666. The mark of the beast that is inscribed on the foreheads and right hands of people. Okay, another quick digression. We need a vocabulary lesson. Gematria. Not too important to us, but it was all over the ancient world. Gematria, I have a definition there, converts names especially, converts nouns into numbers. All right? For a rough analogy, take my name. John, J is the 10th letter in our alphabet, O is the 15th, H is the 8th, N is the 14th. So we might say, instead of John, we might say number 47. Or another rough analogy, instead of saying Trump, we might say number 45 and 47. So the number 47 could mean John or Trump. And that's probably the only thing in the universe that I haven't got.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, end of digression. Gematria provides us with the possible solution to the riddle of 666. Another vocabulary word, transliteration, where you take the letters out of one language and substitute in another language. All right? If we transliterate, use our alphabet letters instead of the Greek, Nero's name and title from Greek, Nero Caesar, into English, we get Nero Caesar. If we take the Greek Nero Caesar and transliterate into Hebrew, we get that weird looking squiggle in the middle of the screen. And I gave you the chart down below with the gematria values of those characters. And if you go home and you're waiting for dinner to warm up and have nothing to do, work your way back and forth between the chart and the Hebrew and add it up and you will get 666. Now, if we just look at the gematria value of Neron Caesar in Greek, we don't transliterate into any language, we get, no, not 666, sorry. We get, what is it, 1,300, oh, I do have it up there. Where are my notes? We get 1,332. You're math geniuses, you'd already figured this out. We get 666 doubled. Why? Well, Nero is the model of the Antichrist. He persecuted Christians in Rome, I said, in the 60s. He committed suicide in 68. But it was widely reported that he was going to come back and return to power. Domitian, who persecuted Christians the second time, he reigned from 81 to 96. And it was later in his reign when we think this book was written. He was, to people, Nero redivivus. He was Nero returned. He was Nero doubled, 666 times 2. All right? Nero's name in Latin is simply Nero. It does not have that final nu in the Greek or in English. If we transliterate the Latin for his name and tell him to Hebrew, we get, you go back to that chart and see what I mean. Take the Hebrew in and out, it's worth 50. So we have 616. And in fact, the oldest surviving manuscript we have of Revelation, it's called Papyrus 115, gives for Revelation 13:18 the number of the beast as 616. Some other early manuscripts, Codex Ephraemi Scriptus, say that one 10 times fast. That also gives the number as 616. So the two numbers in the textual tradition of Revelation, 666, 616, reinforce each other in suggesting that the referent is Nero. Or, to put it bluntly, the mark of the beast is the number or numbers identifying the Roman Empire as represented by the persecuting emperors Nero and Domitian. Make sense?
Yeah.
Well, not everyone subscribes to this explanation. Whoa, I missed a screen, didn't I? Ha ha! Okay, got carried away there. Good thing you can go back to this. Not everyone subscribes to this idea. Peter Goman teaches at Shepherd's Theological Seminary in Cary, North Carolina. I know, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Goman is not a major scholar, and Cary is not a major seminary. But I'm giving you a URL here. When you have time to go back to it, it's really pretty interesting. He tries to poke holes in that gematria theory. All right? But we don't have to depend on the number 666 to recognize that Rome is the arch enemy in the book of Revelation. We can go to chapter 17. That's the chapter that tells us about the whore of Babylon. Can I say words like that in church? Babylon. The whore of Babylon is a harlot who sits on a scarlet beast. There's that beast again. She also sits on 7 hills. She gets around. Now, if you remember, the geographical center of ancient Rome, east of the Tiber, was the 7 hills, the Palatine and so forth. Or if we don't know our ancient geography, the end of chapter 17, verse 18, I think, spells it out for us. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. As you can understand, the book of Revelation, with its slashing vilification of the Roman Empire, became pretty embarrassing to Christians later. After 312, when Constantine won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and converted to Christianity, especially embarrassing after 380, when Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But by then, Revelation had become so firmly ensconced in the developing New Testament canon that it couldn't be jettisoned. All right? I want to conclude with a disclaimer. What time do we have? Yeah, I thought you we'd be about out of time. Yeah. It may sound from this like I know a lot about Revelation. I've deciphered the riddle, I've broken the code, and I assure you I have not. This book is just maddening in its obscurity, its obfuscation, its impenetrability. And I'll give you one example to quit with. I gave you a brilliant explanation of 666, right? Brilliant. Well, if we go back to 1 Kings 10:14, we read this. The weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. About 1,000 years separated Solomon from Nero. Why that amount of gold back in 1 Kings? I don't know, and I haven't found any commentaries that seem to know. Obviously, there's still things about the numerology of the ancient world that we haven't recovered. Pretty interesting. I go back to the first slide. Again, this is my email address, and please feel free to use it. I'm sorry I took the whole time. I promise next week I'll leave some time for you. The thing is, it's such a crazy book. But this gives you a week to reread it, okay, and come back prepared. Yeah, I started by saying I sometimes think Revelation has caused more trouble than it's worth. I may have some of you thinking that by now. But I promise next week I will explain, I'll be a good Christian. I'll explain why it does belong at the end of our Bibles. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and hope to see all of you next week. Thank you for coming today. Thank you.
All right. I'm sorry?
I was talking to Virginia. Are you taking that back there?
Yeah, I can do that.
I think that's what needs to happen.
Do you know how to untick it off of here?
I
I feel like
have
there's an
been
easy
shown
way.
so many
I'm
times.
just going to unscrew it. Okay. Wonder if this is his.
Yes, the whole thing actually goes back to Mary, I think.
Okay.
Things have changed.
I don't know how to make this
Yeah.
stop. Okay. I will.
That's his personal.
Okay. Let me go do that now before it gets hairy.
Are you taking that too?
I'll do that.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yay. The least I can do. It's not that hard, and yet it is. Oh, I almost hit you with the door.
You didn't bump me. That's okay.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Standing over there.
As long as I didn't knock you over.